without further ado, unless there's any reasons to delay, if everybody's ready, I'd like to invite the first speaker from the proposition to open the debate.
Sorry,
Hello.
I didn't hear the mic check. Am I audible?
Oh, yeah, you are. No problem. I think your teammate might have sort of answered for you. But yeah, you are absolutely audible. Thank you very much. If the speakers, I will start the stopwatch at the point when the first word is sort of spoken. So if you are saying, hold on for one moment, or you're just sorting yourselves out, don't worry, the stopwatch won't start until you're ready to begin. And without further ado, unless there's any other reason to delay, I'll invite the first speaker from the proposition to open the debate.
Panel, here's a fun fact. There are more CEOs named Joe than there are female CEOs in the United States. We think this shows evidence that equal rights are not transferred to equal opportunities for women in even Western societies, not at least in the third world. We think it's hard to solve this issue locally. Thus, we are very happy to be side of the motion, which tackles a radical solution to believe that large institutions should accept only female country delegates. We think that at the point of which these institutions influence male and females globally, we think that we should create better opportunities for women to access those positions. Firstly, a bit some framing and definitions. So in the status quo, these institutions are extremely male-dominated. Women face very hard and difficult barriers to accessing those opportunities. Rather, it can be through perception that they're seen less capable from accessing those positions to be in power, or they are simply have less access to education, pay gap, and other things that would give them the experience and knowledge and the a CV to be able to access them in the first place. However, even if there are rare exceptions when women are having ability to get through those barriers, they're seen as tokens. They're seen as something that is very rare. They're seen as something that, look, we have one female on our team, thus we're probably not that problematic. What are international institutions? These are important institutions that help dictate the world order. We see UN, World Bank, IMF. Countries have inherent interests to be represented in those institutions because it gives them international credibility, and especially for poorer countries because it gives them loans, it gives them things that they otherwise have a difficult time accessing. Delegates are representatives of each of those states. They vote on the behalf of the state. They present the interests of their country. We think that each country should select a female delegate. No, thank you. What is our stance on the side of proposition? We support positive discrimination. However, we believe that the status quo is far too slow at solving the difficulties women face in those international institutions. Because especially at this elite institutions where they influence male and female equally populations, we think that at the point of which you're still female dominated, some radical change is necessary. We will have three arguments instead of proposition today. Firstly, we'll talk about how we have a principled duty to give those women those accesses. Secondly, about how we're giving better opportunities for women in other areas where they also face discrimination. And then thirdly, Jana, in second, we'll talk about how misogynist states are now improved for women. First argument then about how we have a principled duty. We think that there are structural barriers that prevent women from accessing the same opportunities as males do. Firstly, we think that men have a benefit of the doubt, right? Because when it comes to a prestigious institution which will represent your country's interests, where you want to have influence as a state, it seems like a rational choice for a state to choose a male delegate over female, because sending a male delegate means that you will have an interest get through. You don't want to risk to send a woman because she might get off as hysterical and uncredible. We think that states are thinking that they make a credible choice, a rational choice when they put a male through. Secondly, we think states want to send delegates who are perceived to have enough experience, knowledge, familiar with high-profile political institutions. So just a second. That is why they usually send people who have been experienced with been ministers in the past, prime ministers, and because women have a hard time accessing those positions locally, they're unable to get the right experience to get the push to be delegates. That's why UN general secretaries have only been male and never female. Before I go on the second reason why we think that there's a principled duty to injustices for women, I'll take the POI.
So why don't you support just having all politicians be women?
We think that it is very hard to solve each state locally different because they have different barriers with which women face. However, I will talk about in my second argument about how we're able to solve those issues locally as well. So Secondly, we think that there's a normalized misogyny in the international society, and it's actually highly present in the Western societies, right? Females in power are often seen as bossy and hysterical, just as opposed to just being the boss. That's why even when you have an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a congresswoman, a senator is able to call her a F-word, B-word, and get away with it, even though it's highly inappropriate. But then this means that even if women are able to get through those obstacles, through those structural barriers which prevent them to accessing those positions in the first place, they still face sexism in the workplace. Thus, they're usually deterred from trying to pursue their careers in politics as well. And consequently, even if they are getting through those barriers, they're seen as tokens. They're seen as something that is rare. But yet, on a comparative, as long as men have those positions, and as long as there are male-dominated positions, these issues are going to be perpetuated. These issues are going to be very hard to tackle. That's why radical change is necessary. We think that because the status quo is unjust, because it structurally prevents women from accessing the same positions as men do, their voices should be heard, especially at the point at which we have an international level, which impacts women as equally as it does men. We think that we have a duty to give women the access, give them the thing that they need to get representation. Second argument about how we're solving women issues in other areas as well. We think that women face discrimination in all areas where there's certain hierarchy, where there's certain imbalance of power, where there's someone who has to be the boss. That's why female CEOs, female in local governments are very rare. And as long as this is male dominated, the issues will stay and the misogyny is going to be perpetuated. That's why women are deterred from trying to pursue their careers as CEOs and getting like political institutions, because they know they'll face discrimination, they know they'll face double standards. And this is like gives them emotional labor, like constantly worrying about whether when a woman speaks out, if she thinks that she will be seen credible, if she'll get the same credit as her male counterparts do. But then that's why at the point at which we have all female delegates in international institutions, we help to shape those issues in these areas as well. Why? Firstly, we think this directly changes the perception that women cannot be in charge, that they cannot be credibly and cannot do their job in a position of power well. We think this directly challenges that perception in the status quo. But secondly, we think that now less women are going to be deterred from trying to have political careers in the first place, because they know they will be able to get that they will be able to get a high position in the down the road. Thirdly, we think that now we give direct incentives to political elites and parties to give women opportunities, because they know that women are going to be their delegates. They're going to be someone who represents their interests and their interests, and that is why it is now in their incentive to give women the experience they otherwise wouldn't, because they know that these women are going to represent them in an international level. But yet on a comparative, and we have political parties which are very sexist and are never going to accept women in them amongst themselves, they will now have direct incentives to do that, to enforce them. Fourthly, we think that we actually give more experience to women at the point at which they're able to get those positions. Why? At the point of which their mandate as a delegate ends and they go back and try to pursue their political careers locally, they now have more credibility, they're more respectable in their governments, in their societies, thus they're better at like reaching careers and reaching success at home at the point of which they actually already get the experience, but they're only able to do that at the point of which we have positive discrimination, which gives them those accesses in the first place. We think that on our side of the house, we give direct change of incentives that otherwise wouldn't be present, because we give women opportunities on different levels, because we give people who otherwise perceive women as incapable, we now directly give them selfish incentives to give them the opportunities in the first place. We think that we were able to get positive trends with directly challenging the narrative that they're unable to be good and credible at those situations. Why do it with of proposition today? Firstly, because we believe the status quo has been unable to change any of the issues women still face today, even though they have equal rights. Secondly, because we think that it's unjust that women have faced structural barriers, that we need something to challenge them. And thirdly, because we're able to give them opportunities they otherwise wouldn't. We're so happy to be on side of proposition.
Sorry, I'm just gonna adjust my camera.
No problem. I'll give the judges a moment anyway to collect your thoughts and make a few final notes.
We don't disagree that the plight that women face all around the world is massive. We think this is a plight that falls most heavily on the vulnerable women who would benefit from these institutions being effective, being able to fulfill their mandates in a way which is correct. I think that what their policy does is it harms the most vulnerable women on the ground, but it also harms these international institutions and their ability in general to fulfill their mandates. On opposition, what we believe, crucially, is that we don't think that equality is zero-sum, so we're incredibly proud to oppose. Our stance is simple. We think that countries should have the ability to send their own delegates and select whoever they want that is the best for the task. Generally, this does result in a mix of men and women. For example, Nikki Haley is a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, although we can see that it is in status quo, regrettably, majority male. Two burdens in this debate. First, we are going to win this debate by demonstrating to you that the mandate or the ability of international institutions to fulfill their mandate in general becomes massively lessened on our side of the house, and this is an impact that affects everybody, so it is going to win us the debate. But second, we're going to demonstrate why this hurts women, but even if they want to talk about how this helps women, they need to demonstrate to you why the slight benefits to the area of feminism outweighs the massive harms that occur to everybody when these international institutions become far less effective. With that, I'm going to forward two arguments in this speech about how this harms the ability of international institutions to fulfill their mandates and how this is harmful to the treatment of women. But first, some responses to their case. The argument that they spend the majority of their case on is this principle about how sexism exists, therefore we have to do this policy. The first thing I would note is that there is no real link between the long rant about why sexism exists and that is bad, which is concedable, and why this demands this particular form of policy. The second thing I would note is that this principle is a wash, right? Because we agree that sexism is bad. We think that's generally because men and women are morally equal and they shouldn't be treated any differently. Therefore, this principle is a wash because they're just replacing one form of sexism with another form of sexism and equally discriminating against men to a massively large degree. So therefore, I think that this is likely to be the case to be just a problem-solution mismatch where they just replace one harmful thing with another equally harmful thing. The second thing that I want to note, though, and on the second argument about removing misogyny. So this was just generally an argument about why it's good to have women in position of power, not about why this specific policy would be able to benefit them, but I'll rebut it anyway. The logic of this is that generally you can improve the perceptions of women because now they're seen as good leaders, which inspires things in the future. Obviously, this isn't the case because these are people who you forced to put in power because you didn't have an alternative. So now these are likely to be seen as tokenistic appointments that are bad, but the government could do nothing better than to put these bad women in place. So it's not likely to be inspiring. It's not like these women as people who are meritocratic. The comparative is that even if there is a few women who are on our side of the house, these women are seen as meritocratic and genuinely having earned their spot, so they're much better able to act as leaders and inspirations. No, that's their case dealt with. So, Mike, let's go on to my two arguments in this debate. First, why does this harm the ability of international institutions to fulfill their mandate? The thesis of this argument is that because these institutions require voluntary buy-in from countries, the backlash to this policy is going to be such that it makes it much harder for them to fulfill their mandates of improving international cooperation, of doing things like getting more economic development. This is important in and of itself because it demonstrates to you that countries are likely to get poor, that there's likely to be more international conflict and strife on their side of the house. But furthermore, it affects every debate, including women and men, so therefore it outweighs the benefits to feminism. No. Why is this the case? So the first thing I want to establish is why this policy is likely to have massive backlash, and it's likely to make these international institutions far less popular and legitimate on the ground. First, I think it's likely to be seen as an unfair policy by the vast majority of voters. The vast majority of cases in this debate is either states which are relatively progressive, where they have oppositions to discrimination, and this policy is likely to be seen as massively sexist, or it is the case that these are regressive developing countries where their impacts apply the most, and these impacts are, and in this policy is likely to be seen as one which is deeply sexist and likely to be seen as one which is promoting women in a way which is completely unreasonable. Why is this the case? I think it's likely to be the case, therefore, that it's going to be seen as a sexist and male-hating policy, which furthers a brand of feminism that says that we should care far more about men than we should care about men. But furthermore, this is likely to be seen as a wildly unnecessary policy by many people on the ground, because it's probably true that the average male voter who isn't particularly educated isn't aware of all these barriers of sexism, so they just see this as a strange and unreasonable policy to implement. And the fact that most politicians are male is clearly going to play into how they're going to demonize this policy, how they're going to cast it as unpopular, especially because many male politicians probably wanted to serve in these slots and are going to resent these international institutions for imposing this condition on them. So this is likely to be seen as a sexist and male-hating policy that's deeply unpopular with voters on the ground, and it's going to associated with these international institutions as being just like ridiculous. But second, it's seen as an imposition on their sovereignty. In general, countries value being able to pick their own delegate because it represents their interests at these institutions. At the point at which you impose the narrative that you have to do this to women and that you can only select the females, that you can only select the females, this is seen as an imposition on the sovereignty of these countries because they might have wanted to, because it's seen as trying to impose feminist goals on them or carry out feminist policies that they otherwise wouldn't have voted for had they been able to implement the delegates they wanted. But furthermore, I would note that in many not developing countries, this is likely to be seen as a cultural imposition by the West, given that feminism itself is oftentimes seen as a Western, a colonial imposition that's foreign to the cultures of these countries. Like, for example, many Islamic countries tend to reject Western brands of feminism. This is likely to be seen as imposing that on these countries, and it's likely to see these institutions as elitist, as not being in touch with the needs of the people. Why is this devastating for the ability of these institutions to carry out their goals? The first thing to note is that in liberal developed states, which fund, stop badgering, which fund the majority of these things, this is likely to be seen as something which is like derives these institutions of legitimacy, right? So people in developed states like the US are probably not explicitly sexist, but because they probably don't think that there's such a problem with sexism, because there's laws, for example, that prohibit discrimination in these states, again, they're likely to see this policy as a ridiculous male-hating and unnecessary feminist extension. I think this is likely to embolden socially conservative movements and movements which fight and argue that these international institutions are not representing our interests or something which is not likely to be effective at forwarding the national interest. So it's likely that you're going to see things like less funding for these institutions, or likely less funding for these institutions because it's going to be seen as funding a radical feminist agenda, or these institutions generally being less popular, or less engagement and cooperation with these institutions. This is devastating and important because the majority of the funding for these institutions comes from the wealthier developed nations, where you're likely to see a massive backlash and pulling out of funding. So even if the poor countries want to stay in these institutions, this is likely to be devastating for institutions' ability to fulfill their mandates, like lend money. I'll take a point. No point.
At a point where countries benefit from those institutions more than the benefit from leaving them, we think they're still willing to take this image of sexism against men and accept doing that.
No, because developed countries are the ones which fund these institutions. They don't benefit from them that much. Voters on the ground are going to be asking, why should I be giving the money to the World Bank if it's this radical feminist organization, which hurts developing countries? Finally, I think that progressive states are just likely to pull out. I think it's likely to be the case because it is the case that it probably is the case that, for example, men are not likely to trust the women in these positions of power, or it's probably likely to be the case that there's going to be massive sexist backlash, or also many of these states just are looking for excuses to be able to pull out anyway. Like, for example, they don't want to be part of the Human Rights Council because of the fact that it holds them to account, and this gives them a perfect excuse and an ability to justify to their voters why that is a legitimate thing for them to do. So it makes these institutions far less effective, far less impactful on the ground. Why is this terrible? It means that you hurt the ability of things like the World Bank to be able to pursue things like, for example, giving loans to countries because they have less money, which means more poverty and less of an ability to implement feminist policies on the ground. It means less accountability for autocratic governments that have an ability and a way to justify perfectly now to their population why it is the case that we shouldn't be part of these institutions. We're very proud to oppose.
To ask for the audio POIs, just to make sure that I hear them. Dear panel, the comparative in this debate is not between the fairness that is obviously what the team opposition thinks the status quo is, and between actually positively discriminating women, but is between extremely structurally unfairness of CEOs being marginally only men, of the people in the Security Council being almost only men, with the NATO never ever having a woman as their representative. That is the status quo. There is no fairness in the status quo. You have to engage with that. I'm going to do two major things in this debate. First two major questions about reconstruction, and then my argument that will vastly negate their first constructive as well. So firstly, on the principle, what I'm actually saying is that, again, what I've pointed out in my intro, that there is some sort of fairness that is currently happening, and it is the assumption that their whole negation relies on, right? Because there is no fairness in the status quo. They cannot say that positive discrimination would actually harm it because there is no fairness in the status quo. But secondly, what we do with our positive discrimination is actually making the fairness be possible. Why? As we have already pointed out, because it is impossible for women to have equal opportunity to get into these delicate positions.
Point of
at the point
information.
of which, no thank you, they are always outpowered by the men, because it's more rational to put a man into the general assembly, the point to which women will also always be outvoiced just because they are women, just because of structural racism and sexism in the General Assembly, at the point to which women cannot even get to this delegate position just because they have never been ministers and therefore cannot be like the ones that can even apply for it, at the point to which they have no voice there because they are also outvoiced. So this is a prerequisite what we are doing for any fairness to actually happen. So with that, their negation doesn't stand. But secondly, when they talk about the developed nations, and they say that developed nations are very likely to get out of these institutions just because they have no real incentive to be in, but actually they are very going to be enraged by the things that are happening. Here I have two responses. Firstly, they're very much wrong that those countries do not have any incentive to be in those institutions. If you are, I don't know, USA, China, Germany, I know Germany, not France, Britain, anyway, anyone who is the Security Council, you have a very great incentive to be in UN, because being in Security Council means that you have a vast legislative power over all other countries. Secondly, if you are Germany and you earn a lot of money from the loans that you give to the countries through the World Bank, you have a great incentive to be in the World Bank because you need the money in order for your market actually to work, which means I have given you two structural reasons why they're very likely to get in, because you have incentive to be so. But secondly, we see no reason why you actually would have such a backlash from the people when you have such a model imposed. Why? Because especially in the Western countries, no thank you, we are seeing the rise of the Me Too movements, of the movements for the women's rights. We believe that women in general, people, voters in general, support the female rights, and thus they will not get any backlash from that. But all the racist politicians, politicians that there are very much going to set aside, just as the way this one man calling Cortez fucking bitch will have to sooner or later. So before I move on to my constructive, I would like to have the PR.
Like, clearly Germany and the US are not the developing countries who are likely to pull out. Please engage in the argument instead of strawmanning.
Okay, so please, half of your argument was talking about how we are having developed countries pull it out, which was your greatest impact on those whole UN institutions, because otherwise you have no impact as to the amount of money being there, at the point at which USA is the one giving the most money into the UN or stuff like that. But yes, of course, I'm going to engage with that in my argument that I'm moving on to now. So about the improving status of women in patriarchal countries. So what I'm going to prove to you here is that by appointing female delegates from patriarchal countries, we provide the opportunity for female emancipation there. So look, you have to realize here at the very start that there are great patriarchal misogynistic practices happening in these countries. We have education level in Afghanistan as of 12.6% amount of people, of women actually get educated. We have women in the Saudi Arabia unable to drive cars. Women in Saudi Arabia unable to go anywhere if they don't have some sort of man beside them. We have women with no political power and stuff like that. So it's obvious that they need to have some international pressure, because this pressure cannot come from the inside, at the point to which you have such misogynistic and sexist countries. And we believe these are we providing. But before I move on to the reasons why this is so, two major clarifications that have to be taken into account. Firstly, why women there are unlikely to get into these positions. Very same reasons that have already been pointed out in our first argument, but still. Firstly, because they really cannot apply for these positions. They are simply because they are female, and they're sometimes characteristic to apply for a delegate is to be male. Secondly, because you cannot never be a minister there, because no one will vote you in, because there is such a sexist state, right? So if you want to be a delegate, and you have to have some sort of the prerequisite is of being a minister in that country, you cannot apply for that because you wasn't a minister. But thirdly, because even if none of the practices were actually structurally sexist, no one who is actually deciding who is to be a delegate will approve of a woman, at the point to which he A is sexist, or B fears the public backlash because he made a woman a part of the delegation despite despite the fact that the whole country is sexist. So this first thing has to be clear. But secondly, why do we believe that countries will, despite the fact that they are so misogynistic, going to comply and give the female delegates, despite the fact that they are so misogynistic? Three reasons. One, because they get a lot of international recognition through being a part, for example, of the United Nations. Because you now, if you are India and you are afraid of losing some shred of border because China is attacking you, you have to have some sort of international recognition. You have to have some diplomats, some ties with other countries to protect you. Secondly, because you get money, for example, from the IMF, which is a part of the World Bank. You cannot get the funds that Afghanistan dearly needs in order not to have people starving all over the world, to have hospitals and education built, if you aren't part of World Bank. But thirdly, you cannot get foreign aid from the WHO organization at the point of which you are not a part of it. So in the end of the day, what we have is that they have clear, very great incentives to stay in. That's why they will give that female delegate to at least not have anarchy in their countries. So with that in mind, three major benefits that we have, that it's good to have female delegates in these countries. Firstly, you have to realize that simply the appointment of the female delegates sends a message of empowerment to the world. Because simply the position of a delegate is a powerful position. Just the title itself gives the power to the women. But secondly, when the government has to portray, when a government makes a woman a delegate, it has to portray it as powerful. Why? Because if you are Saudi Arabia king and you want to have domestic legitimization of your own rule, you have to make clear to all of your people that the representatives you are sending to the world are strong and powerful, are the lions that are going to get the Saudi Arabian, legislations through. That is why you will now have to portray this woman as strong, rational, and not as fragile and submissive as it is supposed to be according to your rule. Why is that beneficial? One, because you now cannot say and justify not letting women into football games in Saudi Arabia to the point to which you are letting them to sit in the councils. This also looks like Afghanistan girls actually getting some sort of powerful message that they can do things and not only follow the instructions and be submissive. But thirdly, because also males change their perspective, because they're not seeing their wife that they were previously beating only as submissive, but as some rational creature that they have to follow. So the takeaway of this argument is that we are actually changing the perception of females there, and that is why we are getting some sort of benefits that they are in no way. Thank you very much.
And the Philippines to continue their case. If I can invite the second speaker.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
1 second. Panel, proposition seems to think that the only role of international institutions is for feminism. I think we were very, very clear from the get-go of this debate. Both sides in this debate want to have policies that are going to benefit women. But at the end of the day, we gave you two criteria by which to weigh this debate and adjudicate this debate. We were very clear. We said, firstly, the ability of international institutions to fulfill their mandates and the multiplicity of jobs that they have in the status quo, which isn't just to women. It isn't just having policies that benefit women, although that's something you were able to get on both sides of the house. But second, where you're actually able to get more representation and get more feminism and get more buy-in for the feminist movement. Because on their side, note how their one policy is representation by force. But what they have to prove to you is why this representation is actually going to result in more buy-in from governments on the ground and from people on the ground. I'm going to start with my responses to Team Slovenia before moving on to my contribution in this debate. First issue, note how the thing that their first speaker talked about was that all of a sudden governments are going to start funneling all this new resources in order to have more women that are educated or have more things for women. But this was completely asserted. Never did they give you a reason as to why this is in the interest or incentive of states, especially states who probably aren't happy that now they have to replace all of these men who perhaps had better degrees or something, no, with women. And what they had to do was prove to you, one, that there's an incentive for states to do this, but second, that most states have a capacity to do this. Because note how the most vulnerable states are states that are actually don't have the capacity to now have schools that allow women or that allow more women to access education or all of these other things. Note how most not have the capital to significantly increase the money going towards policies that are specifically for women. And the problem is that they did not engage with the analysis coming from my first speaker. Because what did he tell you? He told you that even if these states do, it takes a significant time lag. And here's why this is important. Because at the end of the day, international organizations have an obligation not just to women, but other vulnerable groups on the ground. People that are going through poverty, people that are caught in the crossfires of war. And the reason this is important is because if you're representative in the United Nations, in the World Bank, in the IMF, is not the person that is the most qualified, but rather the person that you had to put there because of because of this policy. What happens is that there's a significant time lag until countries are able to have, or until poor countries or less developed countries are able to have women that are able to fulfill this role to the same capacity. And note, that is not to say that women are less capable than men, but in countries where women haven't had education right now, there's a significant time lag until you get women that have access or have capital to equal amounts of education. No, next, will states or will they not opt out of these organizations at the point at which you implement these policies? Note how all their examples are states that are developed. They said Germany, France, and the USA. These aren't the countries that are the most vulnerable. These aren't the countries that we're talking about. We are very clear. We said countries that are historically patriarchal, that have significant cultural and religious beliefs, countries like the UAE, countries like Saudi Arabia, are unlikely to succumb at the point at which they literally have to put all the political decisions of their state in the hands of women, regardless of if that woman is just or not. Note that there are states that are going to be completely unwilling to do this. And here's why this was really, really important in this debate, because these are probably the countries that need the most intervention of the UN, that need the most intervention of international bodies in the long run. But at the point at which people on the ground are not receptive, I will let you know when I'll take a point, are not as receptive of these organizations, that's where you do not have the ability of these organizations to actually be successful in the long run. I just want to call out the disgusting lack of response coming from Team Proposition. Two things. We were very clear. We said that feminist institutions are seen as male-hating. So at the point at which you have major institutions that are the backbone of starting small grassroots movements in the long run are associated with things like radical feminism, that's when the perception of these organizations becomes illegitimate. And the reason this was important is because my first speaker explained to you that that's when you have people on the ground that are less receptive to the UN. I said I will let you know when I'll take a point, that are less receptive to the UN coming in and starting initiatives. That's when you have people that are less receptive to the idea of the state building girls-only schools or having schemes that only benefit women.
Point, ma'am.
I think what Proposition had to engage with, that all international organizations have some sort of failure. And this was completely unresponded to coming from second Proposition. Idea that these institutions will have failure. But at the point at which you have states that did not want women leading them in the first place, what's likely to happen on their side of the house is you have them pinning this failure on these women. And the reason this is important in this debate is because note how all of their mechanisms are dependent that all of a sudden, magically, the perception of women will change. But at the point at which these institutions pin their failures on women, that's where you double down on existing perceptions, even if they're not true. Because failures happen on both sides of the house. But what these institutions are likely to do is say, now, this is a failure not of the institution, but of the women leading it. I'm going to have one contribution in this debate. I'll take a point before that. If there's no point, I'll move on. Okay. My contribution is very important. It's about how you increase male capture of powerful positions within nations. The thesis of this is simple. Panel, recognize that making all delegates of these organizations women does necessitate that you then remove all the men that were in these positions in the first place. Because note that they don't just like disappear into the ether. What they do is then go down and occupy powerful positions within states. The reason this is really, really important is because their entire case is contingent on one thing, the ability to change perceptions. But we think that perceptional changes are more likely to happen at the point at which you have women in local positions. And the reason this is important is note that most little girls and little guys don't know which person is representing them in the UN or in the World Bank, but what they do know is who their mayor is. What they do know is who their congresswoman is. What they do know is the person leading local institutions that they're aware of. This is where you're able to changes at the point at which you do not have men capturing, you do not have men capturing the existing political positions right now because they are angry that they were pushed out of the positions they held in these institutions. Why is this likely to happen? We think that this policy does two things. Firstly, it creates perceptional pressure on state governments to then have these men that are now kicked out of their jobs that are probably equally as qualified or like that are probably very, very qualified. So what they do is they have these men in now positions of mayors, of governors, of political advisors, or heads, the very CEOs that proposition was so concerned about, is now more likely to be male dominated at the point at which one, there's a perception that women are taking away these jobs, but second, that there's a political pressure to increase the availability of jobs to these men. What are the impacts of this? Twofold. It's that even if you have women in international organizations, you are still dependent on local governments to implement these policies. So given the state and individuals on the ground perceive these institutions as radically Western or radically feminist, states are less likely to be willing to implement these policies. But second, it means that men have more power over policies that implement women. This is really, really important because you have less support for things like affirmative action policies. You have things like men making decisions that women are probably more capable or more effective in making decisions of. When you have more women and more men in the cabinet, more men in the presidential administration, more men in political positions, you have more men deciding things like sanitary health things that like impact women. You have more men deciding policies about abortion that impact women, and more men that are deciding policies that are probably not, that they probably do not have as much knowledge about. Why is this important? We think this is important because we win on the two metrics we set in this debate. Firstly, the extent to which institutions are effective in fulfilling their role, but the extent to which you get the perceptional benefits that proposition cares so much about. We think equality is not zero sum. Oppose.
Thank you very much to the speaker. Just give the judges a moment. Continue and progress the substantive case of side proposition.
Hopefully I'm audible and there is no problem. Cool, thanks. Yep. Just give me a second, please.
No problem.
Panel, one big problem in the argumentation of the side of opposition. They fail to engage with the reality in which they live. And the reality is twofold. Firstly, of incredibly sexist international and domestic institutions that systematically prevent female participation in politics. And secondly, they fail to engage with the reality where countries don't suddenly leave UN just because UN is funding female education as it does in status quo. Their whole analysis is contingent on states leaving those programs just because they don't like to talk about feminism. But the reality is already here to a certain extent. They never tell us why our policy is so much different that those impacts would suddenly implode and there will be no member state of the UN Security Council anymore because suddenly states don't care about power and nuclear deterrence. We think they already lost this debate. 3 points in my speech. Firstly, on the idea, on the third constructive. Secondly, on institutions and principle. Lastly, on women. So firstly, on this idea that male will capture all of the important positions. First of all, Note that their impact is contingent on the fact that local positions actually determine how the resources from the UN and IMF are distributed. This is a blatant lie because IMF and the UN are the ones who tell you how to spend this money. They are the ones who have literally mechanisms of enforcement, but they send inspectors to your country, and if you're not spending it well, they take your money away. So even if we buy into their analysis about how we get less women in local positions of power, we still have a greater impact at a point where those institutions are able to provide more things for women, which they are more likely to, because when you have more women in positions of power, they are likely to care about female education, or even if not about female education, they are likely to care about femicides like they happen in Mexico. However, secondly, why we don't buy their analysis on why we get less women? Firstly, because we don't see why necessarily you're picking out mayors in order to send them to UN Security Council or any other body, because you probably want to pick people like ministers, like other politicians. So even if we buy into their local analysis, we still have a substantial amount of local politicians that are able to do those things and are able to do things. Thirdly, even if we don't buy into this analysis, we still think we are winning at a point where we change perception. And the response here is because, you know, we don't know who your UN General Assembly member is. Women won't care that much when it comes to this empowerment point. But we think this is simply false at the point where you're a country like United States of America or India that has a lot of things into international relations, where you care about international relations. Those are the people in important positions. We want more women there. We are willing to take the trade-off. So now, with this in mind, let's talk about institutions and where are those international institutions harmed. First of all, as I have already mentioned, we don't see the impacts they're talking about in status quo. States don't leave UN Council because they disagree with certain policies. Why is this so? Because states are certainly more likely to have the UN Security Council seat or UN General Assembly seat where they can vote on any resolution possible than to take these harmful policies that they don't like in the first place. Secondly, Iana tells you that countries like Germany actually make lots of money when they lend money to Greeks who need this money in order to recover their economy. Those two incentives were never engaged by the side of opposition, apart of some accusations how we never explain them. We think they should do it in third op. However, secondly, we tell you that we are willing to, that we think that in general, autocracy, sexist, or democracy, sexist or progressive, care more about the money and benefits they get from those institutions than any gender empowerment policies. Lastly, we tell you that we don't see why the backlash would be essentially so big that it would be unable to promote any of those policies in the first place. We think that even if we buy them and there is some backlash, we are willing to trade this off for more women in important positions where they can actually craft policies that benefit the developed countries and the developing countries as well. With this, we already engage with the metric of the debate where they want to talk about general benefits, even though this is not a debate. We think at this point is a wash because on both sides of the house, the thing is the same and it's a wash if we take them at their best. However, why do we still win the debate? Firstly, on the principle. Look, they never really care enough to engage with our principle where Emma tells you that there are structural reasons where women are not represented in those positions. Why is this so? Because women do not get jobs in the first place. They don't get prime minister positions, or there are very few women who were prime ministers in the status quo. This is why they're less likely to get into those jobs because it's a higher barrier of entry for them. Because when you have less female prime ministers, it means that you can send less female prime ministers to be UN General Secretary. At the end of the day, when you give more, I'll take it in a second, we believe that this is something that they never engage with, and this is the discrepancy we're fixing. And then they come here and say just different form of sexism. No, it's called positive discrimination, that we want to put women in those positions of power in order to allow them the benefit on the long run. The op disagrees.
Okay, if you're talking about countries where women aren't even in positions of politics, then you're just feeding into the idea that you're going to increase the perception of tokenism, that the women are to blame for failures of these institutions. You're just biting into our impacts.
Okay, first of all, this is a practical impact. I will talk more about this later. However, look, this doesn't take out our principle. We think in general, more women in those positions is already better because they're structurally disadvantaged to get into those positions in the status quo. This is not a practically contingent argument. This is why they never really engaged with it. We win solely on the principle point already because we have heard nothing from opposition on it. Secondly, why is it better?
Point of information.
Look, no, thank you. they bring out this idea how they, more women are going to be tokenized and they will have to carry the consequences in the status quo. First of all, we don't think that this is actually, the failures happen, and we agree, and happen on both sides of the house. But Nikki Haley was also on their side of the house and was also had to carry consequences of the UN nation. We don't see why their backlash from their side is so much greater, but let's get into the trade-off. Why are we willing to trade this off? Because we are challenging the perception of women as not being capable to do those things. 3 layers. One, because you actually show women domestically that those women are able to engage in those realities. Secondly, because parties that are misogynist are incentivized to give women more opportunities, right? We tell you, yes, it's not going to happen immediately, but it's going to happen on the long run, because those parties will want to capture those important positions, meaning they're more likely to invest into female education, more likely to invest into things like women actually getting important positions in order for them to fill those positions. We think this is a benefit at the point when you show little girls that are capable of more than just cooking at home and making their husband sandwiches, right? We think that this is already a benefit on our side. But secondly, it's even more impactful when it comes to misogynist states, something that Yana talked about and they never really engaged with. Because in states like, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, it's really hard for the regime to justify why women should not travel alone at a point where they have a female UN representative in the first place. When you have those women in positions of power, you cannot justify micro levels of aggression and oppression that happen in those countries. This is something the OP has failed to engage with in their 2 speeches. And this is the main thing in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. Because yes, we might both care about the general effectivity of those institutions, but ultimately it's more important to care about the most oppressed actor in this debate. And those are the women. Even in Saudi Arabia, women are more oppressed than men. They have less agency. We care about them more. So we are willing to bite the bullet and take the trade-off if we take them at their best. We win this debate because, one, we show that it's better for women in Western society because perception improves. And secondly, it's better for women in misogynist states when they don't have the same opportunities in status quo. Vote for government. Stick with us.
Hello, is this audible?
You are now.
All right, cool. The reason why this prop team loses this debate is because after 6 rounds of the World Schools Debate Championship, they still do not understand the concept of mutual exclusivity. That is to say, at the point at which they concede and say that things like the Me Too movement and other liberal trends exist in the status quo, what that means is that they concede their frame doesn't work and that there are alternatives in getting women into power in the status quo. That is to say, what we want coming from opposition is a different alternative of getting women into power that doesn't involve significantly hampering the ability of international institutions to intervene in war crimes and demand accountability for the most vulnerable countries at this point in the debate. We think that them simply asserting their frame that there are no alternatives and aggressively pushing it does not make up for actual analysis. They haven't proven why it's true. Clearly, we've shown you, and they've shown you themselves, that there are alternatives. I'll talk about 2 general themes in this web speech. Firstly, I'll talk about international institutions, and then secondly, I'm going to talk about feminism. Firstly, on international institutions, we give you 4 structural reasons why you're likely to get backlash from first op. These just got dropped in favor of some mitigation. We told you that what happens to the institutions is that firstly, you embolden xenophobic movements. That means that you get less funding, and secondly, that some countries are likely to pull out. How do they then respond? In second prop, what they say is that they're likely to comply for 3 reasons, because like argued through example, because there's some international recognition, because money from the IMF, and because foreign aid. Guys, these are just examples. These are not structural reasons why they're unlikely to pull. But moreover, notice that these are different organizations. So fine, the US won't cut funding to the UN Security Council, but if it is an institution that it doesn't benefit from, so for example, if it doesn't need the World Bank, or if it doesn't need the Red Cross to the same extent, it reduces funding for them. So what happens then is that the rest of the countries who rely on these institutions are screwed. But secondly, notice that this doesn't respond to the analysis that we gave you from second op about time lag, the fact that you won't have representation for a specific point in time, and at the point at which there are countries that need to erect institutions in order to get these women educated enough to go in. So what that means is that lots of developing countries, even if we accepted their best case that they would stay in these institutions, just would not have a representative for a long amount of time. And that means that they don't get a say in allowing the UN to enter into their country. They don't get a say in allowing the World Bank to give them loans and all of these kinds of things. That is terrible for their case. But finally, from third topic, strawman this and decide to say that it's contingent on them leaving. No, it's not contingent on them leaving, guys. Please stop straw manning and actually engage with the case. What we told you is that it's contingent on the backlash existing, which can take place in many forms. So it might consist of leaving in some instances, which is terrible, and they still haven't engaged with that worst case. But the second thing is that in other instances, it might look like simply cutting funding. So what that means is that even if the largest countries don't leave, what happens is that these international institutions significantly lose a large portion of the money that they need to be able to provide medical equipment and supplies or military aid to the most vulnerable countries. But next, notice that even if we accept that countries have an incentive to enter into, to stay within these institutions, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will. Brexit, ladies and gentlemen, the UK largely benefited from the EU's existence. It still left anyway because it acknowledged that the xenophobic rise of things like the refugee crisis that meant they had to take in more refugees. That goes to show you the power of the individuals within these countries, which was the mechanism that we relied on the ground level, facing backlash against these refugees. On their side, it's just going to be women, which means that they are likely to pull out at that point in time. So even if we took them at their best case and conceded that there were incentives to stay in, it was just far more likely that these countries weighed the incentives to appeal to the people and to appeal to the backlash, which meant they were still more likely to pull out at that point in time. So notice that our harm is still standing, and it's incredibly harmful in this debate. But next, notice that they dropped completely developing countries in this debate. We've proven to you that in a lot of instances, they're likely to pull out. What are the impacts of all of this? One, it means that you can't enforce the laws of war in countries like Saudi Arabia that are currently the most likely countries to pull out because they're incredibly conservative and bigoted. So what this means is that on their side of the house, it is far more likely then that the UN and other institutions lose the ability, and like the ICC lose the ability to hold these countries to account. But even in these instances, at our very worst, where they don't, it is far more likely then that you still cut funding for institutions like the World Health Organization, which means they're less likely to be able to provide things like medical equipment for developing countries. You cut funding for things like Trade Organization, that means that they're less likely to be able to facilitate things like welfare for these countries. But at third, they say, fine, we'll trade that off. No analysis as to why this trade-off was justified. What we told you was simply that it was far more important to save the lives of lots and lots of individuals, even if it came at the cost of some individuals' quality of life. Because notice that in the vast majority of cases, the women who probably were likely to get into power were already significantly privileged at that point in time. What we told you is that you hurt the most vulnerable individuals who have no recourse to these international institutions at the end of the day. So we don't. At worst, we've proven that you significantly cut funding. People die because the international institutions cannot fulfill their function to the same extent. At best, we've proven to you that these countries pull out, and even if they have funding, they lose the ability to significantly manifest that. So the argument stands. Even if it's mitigated, it's still a winning impact. Second issue then, so notice that even if we concede unique benefits to women and feminism, we already win this debate, but I will engage with that in my second issue and prove why we win that as well. I'll take a point first.
Look, why are those policies on our side of the house so structurally different than policies in the status quo that don't cause cuts in funding from the states they're talking about?
Wait, sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, so in status quo, we have UNICEF funding things like menstrual cups for women in Algeria. why is this structurally different than our policies that states don't pull out in status quo, that they don't cut funding in status quo, but they will on our side of the house?
Because the difference is that men still get a say. That was the analysis we gave you from first op that did not get a response. Second issue, feminism. Notice that their quote-unquote principle, just that women are oppressed, therefore we owe them reparations, did not prove why this was the necessary form of reparations. So even if we accepted this principle, it was value neutral at best. But the second thing to notice here is that if we prove to you from our second speaker, which just did not get a response, that in the vast majority of cases, it was far more likely that these countries, that these women would be far worse off, then that means we flip the principle and we win this. So what did they tell you? They gave you 4 things about why you lessen sexism. They told you about perception, they told you it encourages other women, they told you there's an incentive to give women power, and finally they told you about credibility. 1, notice none of these incentives are actually exclusive to their side of the house. At the point where they concede in second prop that you have things like the Me Too movement on the rise, that means that they probably have, and other movements within a lot of countries, that probably means that you get these same incentives anyway. But 2, notice things like quotas in local governments or quotas within businesses can probably achieve the same effect. You don't need to have this extreme policy. But 3, things like the increasing trend of liberalism in the status quo probably means that we can mitigate this to a large extent. But finally, they say at prop 3, and this is the first analysis we hear that this is nuanced, they say that you can't justify local policy as Saudi Arabia at the point where you're sending women to the UN. 1, that is exactly why they're going to leave. But second, notice that under their side of the house, what happens then is they pin the failure on women, which means that they're far more likely to then enact these kinds of discriminatory policies at the end of the day. That is the analysis we gave you from second op that did not get a response. They say that at the point where women are in power, they're going to care, and therefore you implement policy. But notice with the opposition too, that women not being in local positions means that even if the women who are in power in these international institutions impose policy, it's unlikely that you're going to get any follow-through from the local governments who are misogynistic and opposed to these women. But finally, they say that you have local politicians on their side in order to mitigate this. 1, I thought your frame was that there were no local politicians, and therefore that was the extent of your harms. But 2, there's a spectrum of countries, and clearly we win. What we've proven to you in this debate is that we win the issue of feminism, and that means that we win their metric. But even if we don't, we win the more important issue of having women, of not having war crimes, and of not having the WHO fail. I'm very proud to oppose.
Sorry, 1 second. I need to get my timer. Opposition had to do 2 things in this debate. Firstly, they had to prove that this policy is something that the vast majority of states will be perceptive to, that they will be willing to have, and that they are going to buy into. Note that all of their benefits are contingent on this one piece of analysis that was completely asserted coming from their side of the house. But secondly, they had to engage with the best case scenario of our case, not just assert that it wouldn't happen, but weigh it off. What they had to do was, to the extent that you create significant perceptional harms, they had to weigh this off and tell you why, even at the cost of some states pulling out, this was still worth it. But note how they missed out on the biggest crux of this debate, that the main actor in consideration for these international organizations isn't just women. We both conceded that these are important actors, but it's everyone else that these organizations are accountable to. And to the extent to which we proved to you that you hinder the ability of these institutions to effectively cater to all of the people they're accountable to, we win that issue already. The POI from Prop 3 proved that they did not understand what this debate was about. Because it's not just about will states, like, are states actively against feminist policies or not? It's about whether at the point at which you replace all the delegates, all the people deciding the policies for their state, will they still be okay with having these institutions intervene in their countries or not? What did we give you in this debate that was really, really important? And why does this weigh far greater than the impacts of opposition? Because note, both sides agree that we want to empower women as best as possible. But to the point at which you ensure on their side of the house that you do not get the perceptional benefits they care so much about, that you do not get the ability of women to actually implement policies that are going to benefit women, we think they already lose on the very metric they set up for themselves. We were very clear. The counterfactual isn't upright saying, oh, no women in politics, no women represented anywhere. They had to be realistic and reasonable. They had to recognize and concede that the world we live in right now is a world where there's a growing trend towards having more women in politics. The examples they gave you concede this themselves. They said AOC. They said the literal WHO leader, the last WHO leader, was a woman. They had to concede that there's a growing trend of having female representatives. So it's not some or everyone. I mean, it's not everyone or no female representatives. They had to recognize that in the status quo, we still have representation. So they had to prove the unique benefit on their side of the house. Two reasons why we win this debate. Firstly, you protect the ability of institutions to fulfill their mandates. Two pieces of analysis under this and weighing. First, prop makes a deadly concession. They say, but not all countries have women that are capable, have women in political positions. And this is where they absolutely demolish their own case in this debate. So what they concede then is they concede that the women in these countries that perhaps don't have as many qualified women in politics right now are going to be the very women representing them in the UN, which buys into our biggest impact that you do not get the perceptional benefits on their side. At the point at which these institutions and states are willing to blame women for these institutions failing, at the point at which they blame women not being good enough, not being experienced enough, not having the capacity as in the same way that men do, you do not get any of the benefits that their entire case is contingent on. But second, at the point at which the most patriarchal states pull out, it is the most vulnerable women that you leave behind. So even if we accept that these institutions have a significant obligation to women, it is these very women that you leave behind. Because states that both sides conceded this by the end of this debate. This is crucial because it means that the very women in the worst, the most patriarchal, the most misogynistic countries are the countries that are likely to pull out because they do not want to have their policies dictated by women. So it means in countries where there's oppression, in countries where there's not enough education, in countries where it's men deciding the laws that impact women, you do not have the ability of the United Nations or the World Bank or other institutions to intervene. But the fact that you maximize, secondly, the ability of movements for equality to be viewed as legitimate. This was the very metric that proposition set up for this debate. The only response they had to our extension was, oh, no, that's not true. There's no women in politics. They had to engage because if they want to talk about representation, that only happens when you have women in local politics. That does not happen on their side where men capture local organizations and local politics. We were very clear. We said equality is not zero sum. Oppose.
Thank you very much to the speaker for concluding the case for Team Opposition, Team Philippines. We'll just take a moment for the judges to look at their notes and then before inviting the final speaker for the debate. 1 second. Unless there's any objections, I'd like to invite the final speaker for the debate to conclude the case for Team Proposition, Team Slovenia, and conclude the debate as a whole.
There were two huge strategic problems that opposition gave that I don't think that they should be able to get away with and win this debate, right? Firstly, I believe there's a huge contradiction in the case this other opposition brings to you, because I don't think it's fair for them to claim in first argument about how we have this extreme patriarchal societies that would much rather pull out than just put a female delegate in international institutions, and at the same time in third argument claim that these same societies will give women local representation and let them play mayor while men are are able to be in the elitist and most highly international institutions. Secondly, their own status quo is not actually what they're engaged with, right? Their own status quo is what works against them, because they cannot talk about how there's this huge liberalization and how we have Me Too and positive change, and at the same time claim is that countries will likely backlash on our model. I'm so happy to be a side of proposition where we're actually addressing the issues in the status quo. Two questions. Firstly, about whether this our model is likely to work. Secondly, when do we actually improve female conditions, right? Firstly, the side of proper opposition talks about how we actually force these states who are extremely patriarchal, who don't want women delegates, who don't want less capable representatives, and they will likely to pull out. Two things. Firstly, we think that we actually gave you in first proposition, mind you, structural reasons why these countries now have selfish incentives, rational decisions, why they are likely to pull women in positions of power. Because it means that at the point of which you just educate your women and you give them better representation, when you give them the experience at the cost of losing your seat in the Security Council, losing the loans that you need to boost your economy, we think that this is a trade-off they're likely to make at the point of which it costs them international representation, influence on the global scale. But secondly, with Tina, they also talk about how the status quo is a lot more liberal, and how there's Me Too, and how there already are positive changes, that this model is unlikely to be effective. It's unclear to me then, why is there this backlash likely to happen? Why are people likely to think this is going to be a man-hating principle? Secondly, about how we improve female opportunities, right? Because again, it's absurd to me how they talk about how women will now have better local representation because now the male delegates are able to play in the big game. But the status quo doesn't tell you this, right? Women don't get those representation in those patriarchal societies. Why? Because if you want a delegate that has knowledge, which has expertise, which is familiar with how political institutions work, they need to have experience. That is why they take most of the positions of mayor and local representatives. That's why I gave you in first argument the structural reasons why this is exactly the reason why females are likely to get more experience locally as well. Because countries realize that they are going to be the ones who are going to represent them in the international scale. Thus, they want to be able for them to have those experiences, to be able and efficient in doing that, right? We think that this is like, in order to have a justifiable delegate, you need to give them experience. But secondly, about misogynist states, right? Because Ayana tells to you, in order for patriarchal societies to have women representatives, they have to change the inherent perception that women aren't able to be in position of power. That is exactly why, even when third opposition talks about how only privileged women are best going to be able to get those positions, in order to get those women in the position of power where they represent the entire state in the first place, you need to, as a patriarchal society, address the inherent perceptions that women cannot be in a place in power. But this is largely going to benefit women as a whole, because now you're going to be able to challenge examples and challenge the ways where they're unable to get those opportunities in the first place, because society deems them as less capable in having those positions in the first place. But secondly, we talk about how when we give them the opportunity to push to go to the international world, they're able to push for legislation that is going to benefit for women in the long term. We think that this is largely the benefit as a whole, the side of opposition never engaged with. Why do we take this out of the debate at the end of the day? Firstly, because we are actually addressing the real problems in the status quo. Women are unable to get any representation because of the inherent sexism that is facing their issues, because we're actually giving practical impact, because we're actually engaging with the status quo. That's why we take the debate. I'm so happy to be in Team Slovenia.
Thank you very much to all the speakers from both sides for a very engaging debate. And like I said, congratulations for getting to this part of the tournament. The judges, I will be notifying the outcome unless somebody's already in here to do so, to let them know that we are ready to go to our breakout room. You guys can all take a moment to relax. In terms of the speakers, the judges' job still continues. And we will try not to keep you in suspense for too long. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.